Hello. Hi, my name is Maria Xynou. I work with Claudio, a Tactical Tech. It's an NGO based in Berlin. But today I won't be talking to you as part of Tactical Tech because I'll be talking about a project that I've been working on independently in my free time called Surveillance Without Borders. Just a disclaimer from the beginning. So first of all, anything I say in this talk has nothing to do, again, with my employers or does not express their views. But also, because I tend to speak a little bit fast, if and when I do, please do something like this or anything else that will kind of hint to me that I should speak slower and more clearly. Great, thanks. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to ask, and honestly, how many of you feel that the Snowden revelations are a bit too 2013 or a bit like old news? Okay, great. I'm glad you're open about that. So this is going to be another talk about the Snowden revelations. I'm sorry to disappoint you about that. But here I try to take a different twist in the sense that I don't know how you feel about the revelations, but personally I was very frustrated that they were leaked in such a way where when I wanted to find specific information to answer specific questions as a researcher, it was kind of impossible to do so. So for example, when I had questions like, oh, what do the documents mean for, I don't know, human rights activists? Or which documents are specific to Greece, the country I come from? Or, I don't know, which documents show which companies have collaborated with the intelligence agencies? I was like, okay, good luck finding that information in all of the documents. I mean, sure, there has been a lot of work to kind of categorize them and to make the documents more searchable, and that is all fantastic. But I don't know, I felt like in the end of the day, they were kind of sitting on a gold mine of information in terms of how surveillance to some degree has been carried out around the world, which parties have been implicated, and what does that mean. I thought that a lot of useful information that was in there was kind of getting lost through this, thank you, through this somewhat dump of information which was non-categorized. And so I decided to go through the documents and basically the revelations as they were already organized by the Courage Foundation and to ask questions based on them. But there were three main things that I wanted to address based on the documents. And these are three of the most mainstream rhetorics, which I'm assuming or guessing that many of you have probably heard of at some point or the other. The one rhetoric which you probably hear more so outside of Europe and outside of the US is that, oh, surveillance is an American issue. The Snowden revelations are an NSA American issue. They have nothing to do with the rest of the world. Or it's a Western elitist topic, nothing to do with us. So that is one argument that I personally have been hearing a lot. Don't know about you guys, but probably. The second thing that we all definitely have heard is that surveillance is strictly carried out for the purposes of preventing and detecting crime and terrorism. And while I think that to some degree that probably is true, or I hope it is true, at the same time, we're suspecting, or we have seen from the revelations, that there are many other reasons for carrying out surveillance which expand beyond those. And then the third rhetoric, which is very similar to the previous one, is that no, surveillance is strictly carried out for national security purposes. That is why there are warrants. That is why there are specific legal requirements, which are prerequisites to carrying out surveillance. And so all is good. So as part of my work at looking at the documents, what I wanted to do is basically examine whether these three most common rhetorics are accurate or not, or to what degree they are accurate. To do this, I started asking some very basic questions that I personally was interested in, like who is doing surveillance? Why are they doing it? How are they doing it? How has it been implemented? Who are they actually targeting? What data are they collecting? Where are they collecting this data from? Who are they collaborating with in order to do the surveillance, and so on. And so based on these different types of questions, I did some data collection based on the documents, basically collecting data manually from the documents which answer these types of questions for each one. And then this was kind of, this data collection was then categorized under 6 categories, which I'll talk about in a bit. And that kind of led me to the conclusion that actually surveillance, based on data collected from the documents, shows that it is carried out globally. That is definitely not an American issue, even though these are NSA documents. Second of all, second and third of all, unlike the common rhetoric that is carried out for national security purposes to prevent and detect crime and terrorism, in fact, it really does look like that in many cases, surveillance is actually carried out to reinforce the US agenda, and by that what I mean is to protect and enhance their political and economic interests. And that is very clear when we see, for example, that some of their targets who they heavily invest in spying on are actually political leaders around the world and various corporations. And so as part of this research, well, here's where the data has been collected, or this is where you can find it online. If you are a GitHub user, or if you're familiar with GitHub, you can go to the Surveillance Without Borders GitHub repository, and you can contribute to the data collection, or you can suggest other ways of collecting data or different types of methodologies. Please contact me with any other questions you may have. But even if you're not a GitHub user, still please feel free to get in touch, and we can find ways of making sense out of the documents. Because, like I said, I feel like they provide a sort of gold mine in terms of information, and I think this shouldn't just be, forgotten just because it's not hot in the news anymore. So this is Surveillance Without Borders, the project. If you go to the website, surveillancewithoutborders.com, you'll be able to see it. It includes a global data map. It's a visualization. When you click on each country around the world, you'll be able to see which documents are specific to that country. And by that, the way I did that was that, for example, when a document refers to a specific country, then it has been, put there, basically. But not only which documents are specific to every country in the world, but also there are 6 broad categories, which you can see, which I won't get into detail right now. And you can find which documents under each of those categories are specific to your country, and then you can find data collected under questions like the ones that I mentioned earlier. But today, I will be although Surveillance Without Borders covers a whole wide range of topics, so it looks, for example, at how political leaders are spied on, it looks at mass surveillance, it looks at target surveillance, it looks at collaborations between intelligence agencies, and so on. Today, I'm only going to be talking about the role of corporations. And the reason why I'm doing this is not because I want to have this anarchist attitude against corporations or anything of the sort. It's just that I genuinely find their role in the global surveillance ecosystem very, very interesting. And that is because, based on the documents, they are in some cases portrayed to be targets of surveillance. In other cases, they're portrayed to be allies of surveillance. Sometimes both. Sometimes it's not very clear exactly what they are. But some companies have definitely played an interesting role. This slide that you can see here, you might be familiar with it. It pertains to the NSA's objective, which has to do with collect it all, sniff it all, know it all, collect all the data. We don't know what we're going to do with the data, but let's collect it all and figure that out later on. So how do they even get to do that? How do some government agencies get access to all this data? To a large degree, they have collaborators. This here, again, you might have seen this slide, Got Fiber. This is about how, by the way, I really like their sense of humor. This here basically relates to how they try to tap the fiber optic cables, which make up the backbone of the internet. And so by getting access to that, they're able to sniff, collect, and passively collect huge amounts of data, which otherwise they wouldn't be able to have access to. Practically, how do they get access to fiber optic cables? Well, on the one hand, they do that through collaborations with other intelligence agencies of other governments around the world. Interestingly enough, some of those third parties include Italy as well, which have collaborated with NSA in providing direct access to the fiber optic cables, which make up the backbone of their internet, and many other governments around the world, as you can see. And the GCHQ, interesting enough, has its own program for tapping cables, which is called Tempora, which you might have already be familiar with. This is one of their programs called Mastering the Internet, through which they, kind of literally try to master the internet, so to speak. And that's kind of like an exaggeration, or their way of saying that we want to basically collect as much information as possible. We want to collect everything, analyze it, process it, infer, and basically have some certain control over the internet. But to do so, again, they would need some corporate partners, because a lot of companies basically do provide this, own this infrastructure, and so they would have to be the ones who would provide them access to it. So some of the corporate partners of Tempora, of the GCHQ, include the companies listed here. Some of them you're probably very familiar with, such as Vodafone. Many of the subsidiaries have worked with the GCHQ in doing this, as well as British Telecommunications. But then what we can also see is that there also have been more strategic ways of partnering with companies, more obscure ways, which are codenamed, for example, Fairview, Stormbrew, Blarney, and so on. And these are code names for partnerships between intelligence agencies with specific companies, which often are not identified for the purpose of getting access to fiber optic cables. One of the main partners, as has been identified from the documents, is AT&T, one of the world's largest telecommunications providers. And here, when we say Fairview, Fairview is a code name which is often used for the partnership with AT&T, whereas Stormbrew refers to the partnership with Verizon. I just include this snippet here because I think it's interesting to see that the NSA has been collaborating with Fairview, or may we say AT&T, since 1985. So it's not something new. For many decades now, they've already aggressively been collaborating closely with this intelligence agency in providing them this type of access. And I think this raises a whole bunch of questions, because what does it mean when one of the biggest telecommunication providers that we all trust and rely on actively provides this type of access to intelligence agencies without court oversight, without public debate, or any of that? Again, another slide from Fairview, AT&T. Here you can see, well, the thing that triggered my interest the most from the slide is about how their key targets are global, again, to show that this is not restricted to the US, that they actually do have a lot of global targets. Here's some of the funding that has been allocated, some of the millions which have been allocated in 2010, 2011 for these partnerships with these companies. And then the question is why? Why do they want to tap cables? Why do they invest so much money in doing so? Why do they go in such large extents in having secret collaborations with companies, with telecom providers, to access communications? Well, as we can see again from the documents, one case is basically because they want to infiltrate the communications of people at the United Nations. So this is an example of how they try to collect data about the talking points of the UN Secretary General prior to negotiations. There are many other documents which illustrate, which show clearly how they try to collect data of various government representatives attending the United Nations, even at the UN Security Council. There are other cases where you can see that the purpose of tapping to cables is to gain access to the communications of governments, of political leaders around the world, attending, for example, the Summit of Americas, attending the Copenhagen Climate Summit in London. Also, many EU buildings and EU embassies around the world have been bugged. And here's one example of those with the UN, for example, where Ambassador Rice basically asked the NSA to intercept the communications of government representatives so that she could build her strategy prior to the procedure of voting on sanctions against Iran at the United Nations. So what we can see here is that surveillance, to a large extent, is actually a tool for building building strategies, for building agendas, for deciding how you're going to negotiate with others on important global affairs and negotiations. However, for me, this is very concerning because, as we know, it's not necessarily the case that every single country can do that. Not every country has the type of access that the NSA has. Not every country has the resources, the infrastructure that it has, and so on. And so does this mean ultimately that the US has an advantage, a political advantage, when it comes to global affairs and negotiations? And what does this mean in the end of the day for how the world works and for what decisions are being made, whether that's for climate change, whether that's for oil, whether that's for sanctions or anything? But companies have not only collaborated with intelligence agencies. In some cases, they've also been targeted. Here are some examples of some of the main telecom companies which have been targeted by the NSA as disclosed by the documents. The interesting thing here is that when you look into the details of the documents, you will see that the main reason why they're targeting these companies is because they often, or well, at least all of these do, or most of them do, they provide services to important political figures, or to government representatives, or to EU representatives. That is the case, for example, with Belgacom, which is a major Belgian telecommunications company, which provides services to MPs of the European Parliament and to many other high-profile political figures. And so by infiltrating the networks and by spreading the malware region in those networks, they were able to get access to EU members' personal email accounts and so on, which again then fed into the US, into the NSA, and then helped them develop their agenda and their strategy and had this kind of advantage that I discussed earlier. Again, similarly, we can see that the reasons why they're interested in telecom companies based in countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and China are kind of obvious. Again, because they serve high-profile customers. So if you can't get them directly, just indirectly by tapping into the companies. But it's not always clear, though, if these companies were always targeted or if there was some sort of collaboration. I think this is a gray zone, but there's no proof, to my knowledge, that there was a clear collaboration. Other examples of targeted companies are satellite companies. These are 3 German satellite companies. And one would wonder again, why are they targeted? Well, again, this has a lot to do with their customers. Some of their customers are major European aerospace firms. So again, by tapping into their infrastructure, they're able to get access to personal information of these companies and have this type of economic advantage when needed. I think this case is particularly interesting. So what you can see here are, again, some of the companies that are targeted, including Petrobras. Petrobras is the largest oil company in Brazil. So again, by exploiting the networks of this company and by getting access to their employees' communications, you can see that this provides the US a sort of unfair competitive advantage through this type of industrial espionage. Same goes similarly for Gazprom, but it's also very interesting that they try to follow the money internationally by infiltrating the networks of SWIFT. They actually do have a program called Follow the Money. And again, this can be justified in the sense that, I mean, in theory, I'm assuming, or to my understanding, they justify this because in order to detect terrorists, following money transactions and so on is kind of a necessary prerequisite for that. But then again, that also raises questions of, is that the only reason why they're doing that? Is it only those types of transactions that they're looking at when they're looking discriminately at where money flows, who is monitoring that process? That could potentially create space for blackmail and many other things, all of which is not really regulated or transparent in any way of how this has been carried out. I think this is a quite interesting case. Again, you might have heard of how the NSA implanted backdoors in Cisco products and also in Juniper network, in Juniper routers and servers, and also how they basically infiltrate the networks of Huawei. I think this is particularly interesting because I don't know, over the last decade at least, and more so, we constantly hear the US arguing that we should not trust Chinese products because they might be backdoored and so on. But it's very interesting to see that, in fact, based on the documents, they're doing the exact same thing, not only to Chinese products, but also to their own American products, which are then shipped to the rest of the world. And the way this is done is that when they put the backdoors, they're doing this while the routers and the servers and other network devices are being developed. And so it's very hard for someone to know if this is backdoored or not when you receive it, when you buy the router or whatever, unless you manually open it and look for the backdoor, which most people probably don't do. And then the question here is why? Why do they go in such great extents in secretly investing so much money in backdooring all these products of major providers when it's not clear that by doing so that they will necessarily be able to target political figures or that they will necessarily be able to target specific companies. Maybe if they're able to control that the specific router is shipped to the specific person, but is that always the case? Not necessarily, and it looks like this was done at a more of a mass level rather than in specific cases. So this also raises questions as to why this is happening. Gemalto is a very interesting case, and one that Claudio really wanted me to talk about. As you probably know, Gemalto is a Dutch firm. It's basically the world's largest SIM manufacturer. And the interesting story here is that basically the NSA hacked into the internal networks of Gemalto and stole the encryption keys of basically billions of mobile phones around the world. What this means, essentially, is that by having these encryption keys, they were able to decrypt encrypted intercepted communications. It means that they're able to potentially monitor communications without having to ask for permission from telecom companies or from governments. This means that they can decrypt data at will without any court oversight, without any legal authorization for that whatsoever. And so this was a huge scandal in the security world, as you probably already know, when we learned that this happened. But I think this is also particularly interesting because we see the extent to which major intelligence agencies go to compromise the security of a lot of the infrastructure and a lot of the services that we use, and in the end of the day, inherently making us all more insecure, I think. Other examples of trying to compromise security are, well, these are three examples. So Kaspersky, many of you are probably familiar with their antivirus software. Some documents clearly show how the NSA tried to reverse engineer this antivirus software and thus making it more vulnerable and so on. Other examples in regards to Apple is about how CIA researchers were specifically paid to try to crack the encryption used by iPhone, try to crack FileVault and other encryption on Apple products. And again, other documents show how they tried to basically crack BitLocker, which provides full disencryption for Windows. Now, these slides, I've included them here because I think they're quite fascinating. Do you know what this is? If you do, please raise your hand. Oh, I was hoping that more of you wouldn't, so that you would be surprised, but anyway, okay. So who knew in 1984 that this would be Big Brother and the zombies would be paying customers? I don't know, I think it's interesting to see how intelligence agencies view us. It's interesting to see how they view some of the platforms that we all rely on, or that many of us rely on, and how interested they are in exploiting these platforms. Now, unfortunately, this document wasn't leaked with many other documents pertaining to it, so it's kind of hard to understand the context. Based on the accompanying media articles that were published with this document, they argue that what they were able to do with iPhone was that they were able to collect data like contact lists, call logs, text messages, even pictures and so on. Though, to be honest, it's not really clear to me if they did so, how they did this. It seems like they probably would have had to have had access to the Apple Cloud, but then if they did do that, do they do that by hacking into it somehow, or did they do it through national security letters where they just provided access? I think this still remains an open question, and it's not very clear exactly how they may or may not have compromised this in the past. But it's interesting to see that now, at least, Apple appears to want to defend its users' privacy and is kind of going against the FBI. It's unclear, though, if in the past the FBI did gain access to certain data or not, and these are still open questions, I think. Now, I think this is, again, a very, very interesting case, which kind of shows some failure from a security perspective, where basically the NSA was able to passively collect certain Facebook traffic. Now, as you can see here, so this is an example of a URL, of a Facebook URL hosted on a Facebook CDN, and what you can see is that it's an HTTP. And because it's unencrypted in HTTP, they were able to sniff this data, and they were able to basically collect data like, what is the Facebook user's ID? And based on the Facebook user's ID, they were able to collect other types of sensitive information as well. Now, this is particularly interesting because, as mentioned before, by tapping into fiber optic cables, they're able to massively collect lots of data. But then once they've collected the data, how do they know which data belongs to who? How can they verify which data belongs to who, and how can they create profiles based on that? Well, by doing simple things like this, for example, by sniffing HTTP unencrypted URLs and traffic, they're able to steal certain information which can then uniquely identify users, such as a Facebook UID, for example. And then why exactly are they interested in this type of data? Well, I think this slide makes it pretty clear that they have a particular interest in social networks and in other major websites that we use in our daily life, like Facebook and so on. And the reason for this is because, like they say, this provides a very rich source of information, which basically enables them to create profiles about users. It enables them to link people together to be able to see who is associated with who, map people's networks, and then based on mapping people's networks, they hope to find targets, or maybe, while not finding targets, maybe they are able to identify new targets that they didn't even know they should be targeting. Who knows? But this is really interesting, I think, because through the different types of data that we give, not only through through major websites like Facebook, but also through our daily browsing activity, whoever is in a position to collect that data is able to create patterns of life and is able, through some statistics and through certain algorithms, to predict with some probability how those individuals are likely to behave. So, for example, going back to the core theme of this event, which is guilty by proximity, even if you have nothing to hide, even if you are not a terrorist and so on, which is all great, maybe, just maybe, somehow your data shows that you're somehow connected to someone who has something to hide. And maybe it's not a direct connection, but maybe it's somewhat indirect. Or maybe your data shows a different you. It shows a different profile than who you really are. And this is something very hard to control, especially since we are not the data collectors. We're not the ones creating the profiles. Others are creating that for us. This is Optic Nerve, which is one of the programs used by the NSA to, again, passively collect data from Yahoo. In this case, this involves the interception of millions of Yahoo webcam images, some of which even included sexually explicit material, though the NSA says that that was not desirable. And what we can see here, which is really interesting, is that they collected more than 1.8 million images from users in about 6 months. So that's kind of terrifying, because it makes you think like, oh my God, why did they collect it like all these years? And the great thing is that now more and more servers, more companies are using HTTPS to be able to encrypt their traffic and so on. It's still unclear what agencies have already collected about users and whether that is, already enough to do the type of work that they're doing. Again, why would they be interested in Yahoo webcam images and chats? Well, again, the purpose of that is to discover targets. Now, these might already be targets that they already have pinpointed that they wanted to find, or it might be for literally, again, discovering who could be a target or who should be a target. And by that, what we mean is like who has suspicious activity, who has the potential of going against our interests in the future. Perhaps we should, monitor them closely, maybe, or maybe not. Similarly, email address books. Various documents illustrate how the NSA passively collected millions of email addresses from across servers like Yahoo, Hotmail, Facebook, Google, and others. And as I say in this document, while this is metadata, like the email addresses, for them this is very useful because metadata, by the way, is information about information. And the reason why this is useful is because you're actually able to tell much more stories potentially than what you can do if you had to collect all the bulk content data. With metadata can very easily be automatically analyzed by computers, and very often it tells stories which cannot be denied. So, for example, if your email address shows that you have contacted specific people, specific email addresses, it's very hard, if not impossible, to deny that that is actually the case. And it's very hard to also deny that you did so in a specific moment in time and in a specific location, unless you're using Tor or something else. So it's very interesting to see of how they're interested in this kind of metadata analysis, and specifically in email addresses, so they can map contacts, so they can map connections. And this raises the question, again, of if it is very clear to them who targets are, if it is very clear to them that they only want to be collecting data for the purposes of crime and terrorism, why are they collecting everybody's email addresses? And why are they investing so much money and so much effort in analyzing it all and matching patterns and so on? Again, I think this is another kind of point of failure security-wise. You might be familiar with Muscular. Muscular is a program which was used to basically intercept the main communications links which linked Yahoo and Google data centers. What this means is essentially that so companies like Google and Yahoo have various data centers around the world, and they basically transmit data from one data center to the other. In the past, they used to do so unencrypted in HTTP, which basically allowed agencies like the NSA to intercept that data. Now, thankfully, they're using HTTPS when transmitting data. These are old documents, let's not forget. But again, it raises the question of what data do they already have? Now that it is encrypted, what exactly is it that they're doing to still get access to this data? Because clearly it had some value in the past, probably still does now. And this is Prism, which I would bet that everybody is familiar with, since many of you are familiar with previous slides. The thing here is, again, you already know this about how some of the major service providers like Facebook, Google, Yahoo, Skype, and so on, basically like data was collected passively from them, and such data could include emails, photos, and so on. Here, though, it's not very clear if these companies were targets or allies. I think it's kind of a gray zone for many of them. Because, sure, the documents do show that they were able to collect data from these companies, but they do not explicitly mention if these companies collaborated or if they were aware of this happening. So Yahoo, for example, last year or so, or the year before, I don't really remember, they released a document where they show that they were legally compelled to provide such data to the NSA and that they legally challenged the NSA for demanding such data. And it might be the case that other companies did as well. Again, there is a gray zone. In many cases, companies are legally forced to hand over user data. And in many cases, their defending of such their defending of users doesn't always, is not always successful. So it is quite a kind of tricky zone. In other cases, though, companies like Google have clearly said that they had no knowledge of this happening, and so they claim that they were victims of this. But in other cases, companies like Microsoft kind of clearly collaborated with intelligence agents for doing so. This document shows how well, here it's not very clear-cut, but it kind of implies that Microsoft collaborated with the FBI in providing direct access to Skype communications and allowing it to passively collect Skype data. However, in this document over here, it's quite explicit that the Microsoft did actually collaborate with the FBI in providing it access to SkyDrive and other services like Outlook, which means that basically it basically worked with the FBI in implementing Backdoors, which allowed it to collect at will communication data from Outlook and SkyDrive and so on, without the need of a warrant, without any court oversight, and so on. And so, since they did do this in the case of SkyDrive and Outlook, I think it's very likely that they did the same with Skype as well. Now, what's interesting here is that what you can see over here are some of the websites that you probably use every day, that everyone relies on. We probably access almost everything here literally almost every day, right? The interesting thing, though, is that these sort of companies serve as a honeypot for intelligence agencies. And what do I mean by honeypot? Instead of, I don't know, imagine agencies or governments suddenly having a law where they required where users are forced to hand over specific types of information. There are some cases like this, like for example, in various countries, like in India, there is the biometric data collection system, and there are other citizen databases, where citizens object to that, and they say, no, this is my private data, I don't know if you are, at a position where you can safeguard it adequately, and so on. But at the same time, we often forget that a lot of the that we actually are disclosing much more information through a lot of services that we use on a daily basis, and that information is probably more valuable than any information that governments could ever ask of us. And so the interesting thing, that is why, for example, that instead of asking us to give them information like who we talk to every day, who we're associated with, what we do, and so on. Instead, they just directly tap into the servers of companies which are hosting that data. In other cases, the other interesting thing, though, is that regardless of whether these companies are targets or allies, in the end, it's kind of not really that much the point, because in the end, they provide their own mechanisms which allow governments to carry out this type of surveillance. And by this, what I mean is basically that a lot of these companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook, and so on, do their own type of surveillance, only that it's covert, only that we don't think of it as surveillance, in the sense that they track users everywhere they go, all day long. Let's just think that almost every single website, or most websites on the internet, include Google Analytics. Essentially, what this means is that Google is in a position to basically collect data about everything that we do, more or less. Okay, everything that we do is an exaggeration, I guess, but what that means essentially is that they're able to see, for example, which websites we access, when we access a website, like which parts of the website we're interested in. They're able to map out our interests. They're able to map out potentially our contacts if we share that information with others. They're able to map out our political interests, our economic status, a lot of information about us just based on following where we go on the internet. If we were to have an analogy of that in the real world, what that will be, for example, is that, I don't know, you have, a badge, or you have someone who literally follows you everywhere you go and, writes down everything that you do. So me speaking to Claudia has been recorded, me going somewhere else has been recorded, everything. And this is exactly what is done on the internet through cookies and through other tracking technologies. And intelligence agencies realize that these are very useful sources for figuring out whatever information they want about populations. And so this is why, as we can see through the slide, they have exploited such cookies, such harmless cookies, or we often think of them as harmless cookies on websites, to be able to collect, to be able to uniquely identify users. Because again, the big challenge is that as an agency, when you collect massive volumes of data, how do you make sense out of it? How do you know which data belongs to who? How can you uniquely identify people? One very effective way of doing that at the end of the day is, again, through the use of tracking technologies, through the use of cookies, which can uniquely identify your computer, they can uniquely identify your browser and other information, and so they can be sure that that information actually belongs to you. And then potentially, once they have identified you, they're able to then create patterns of life about you, create profiles about you, and then if they decide that you are suspicious, whatever that means, then they can potentially decide to, find a way to compromise your computer or to, infiltrate what you're doing and so on. And one of the code names for such programs from the NSA is called Marina. Marina is used for precisely this purpose. Yeah, you can see some really weird code names like, mutant broth, memory hole, social animal, and so on. These are code names of programs carried out by the GCHQ. Again, this has to do with TDI, which is target detection identifier. And so once they have identified targets based on cookies and other things, then they're able to correlate data. They're able to correlate data based on social network activity. They're able to do that. They're able to detect their location based on data they've collected from Google Earth and so on. And based on all of this, they're able to create certain type of profiles. And this is an example which shows basically how the GCHQ kind of is in a position of building profiles merely based on metadata. Like, I think this really well illustrates the power of metadata, because even though this has no content, you're able to see when, where, what, who is doing something. And based on this, you can infer a lot of stories. They might be correct, they might not be, but that is kind of the concern here. So, again, in some cases, as seen from the documents, companies are collaborators. They actively collaborate, and they want to collaborate with intelligence agencies, such as the AT&T, which has done so aggressively. In other cases, they are targets, they're victims, they're exploited. In other cases, it's not very clear, it's a gray zone. But regardless of all of that, and regardless of everything that I've said, at the end of the day, this, I think, is interesting because it has some certain implications for all of us. First of all, what it means is that, obviously, less digital security. for all, basically. Because when they're tapping into the fiber optic cables, they're making everything inherently less insecure. When they're spreading malware, other documents show that they spread millions of malware across computer networks. Again, this is making infrastructure more insecure. The other two things have to do with what I mentioned earlier about who they're actually targeting. So when they target companies, sometimes it's for economic interests. It definitely does not look like they're doing so to detect criminals and terrorists. On the contrary, it looks like it largely has a lot to do with US political and economic interests. So for example, when they're intercepting the communications of other political leaders around the world, this provides the US an unfair political advantage in global affairs and negotiations. When the NSA is spying on behalf of American corporations, as seen in other documents, again, this provides them an unequal competitive advantage in the global markets. And what we see essentially is that surveillance, unlike how it's portrayed by governments and by the media, from the documents themselves illustrate that it is in fact a tool for maintaining, reinforcing, and promoting certain political and economic interests. And that is why I think it's very important that we start thinking about it as a political issue. And of course, in terms of the user, in terms of all of us, it's not, I don't want to spread paranoia through this talk, by the way, because I know that there already is a lot of paranoia out there, and sometimes for some weird reasons, it's seen as a cool thing to be paranoid even nowadays. But I think that we need to be realistic in terms of what is happening infrastructure-wise and what this can mean and what the questions are and what we should be thinking about in terms of what we can do and what the limitations are. So in terms of users, when we know that a lot of companies that we trust have actively worked with governments to give them our data, this is clearly a breach of our trust towards them. And this should raise questions in terms of what services do we choose to use going forward. Another thing is that, generally speaking, it's very hard to know what types of human rights violations may or may have not occurred through all this data collection. Well, for starters, it's kind of obvious, and it has been stated legally and so on, that this is a violation of people's right to privacy and other human rights globally. But for me, the more interesting thing are the chilling effects that kind of come out of this. Because on the one hand, we should know, it should be transparent what kind of surveillance is happening, so that such surveillance can be checked, so that it can be regulated, so that it can be limited, in my opinion, and so on. But at the same time, knowing that the surveillance is happening kind of creates a chilling effect globally, because when we know we're constantly being spied on, then we are less likely, potentially, to express our opinions. But this is debatable, in my opinion, because on the one hand, we see that a lot of us do feel free to say whatever we want on the internet and so on, but on the other hand, we are kind of feeling that we are constantly being observed. And so before sliding into paranoia, I think it's very important to always think of things rationally. Paranoia is a very emotional thing, and it's kind of a byproduct of this. But by raising awareness about surveillance, through presentations like this or through other projects and so on, personally, my aim is not to increase fear, but basically to encourage people to think of things rationally from a cost-benefit perspective. So if you think that after this presentation that you might be spied on and go panic and so on, just think, based on this, would it actually be in the NSA or any government's interest to invest an X amount of money to target an X amount of way? Maybe, maybe not. For most of us, the answer is probably not. And as we can see here, that this is not really about individuals. It's not about me or you or them being under surveillance. Well, it is that too, but not so much. It's more of a societal concern. It's more of a political issue. Because as we can see, what the main targets that they invest in are political leaders and big corporations. And this is changing the way societies work. This is changing the way we are living. And this is changing the mechanisms of power and control. And so this will have an effect on us individually, but it will happen on a bigger scale. And so in that sense, we need to be concerned and not go into individual paranoia. I'm sorry, I had to say this disclaimer. So what now? Well, the good news is that crypto still works, or at least according to documents leaked in 2012. These documents illustrate that They tried to break OTR, which is a protocol for encrypting instant messages. And as you can see here, this failed. So it seems that encryption still works, or we hope so. And generally speaking, encryption is probably one of the few things we can rely on because it's based on mathematical principles. It's not something which is subjective. It's something that's mathematically difficult to break. On this matter, many argue that, encryption is used by terrorists or only by people who have something to hide. And this is a rhetoric which is largely spread by the media, and which is very sad, to be honest. And the reason for that is because, I don't know, the way I see it at least, like, using encryption is basic digital hygiene, you know. It's like saying, it's like basic, it's like the minimum for digital security. It's like saying I won't lock my house at home because I have nothing to hide, or I am not a terrorist. Everybody locks the house to the door, not because they have something to hide necessarily, but because they don't want other people going through their personal stuff, point. Or, you know, and it's exactly the same online. And also, when you are vulnerable, you make others connected to you vulnerable as well. So shouldn't we have responsibility for making everyone more secure? And we can do that by starting off with ourselves. So on this note, there are various resources out there which can help you learn how to encrypt your communications and use other tools. One of these resources, for example, is Security in a Box, which I personally work on, actually, and this is a project from Tactical Tech, the organization that we're from. And what Security in a Box includes is that it has many hands-on guides, which explain to you step by step how to install, use, and troubleshoot, and so on, various types of tools. So, for example, it includes guides for how to encrypt your emails, how to use PGP for email encryption, how to use Tor, which is software for anonymity, how to use OTR for encrypting your instant messages, how to secure your browser, because that is also a very important thing, and so on. But these resources also include tactics, like tactics about how to think about digital security. Because I think it's very misleading at the end of the day if we think that, okay, I've got PGP for email encryption, I've got this, I've got that, now I'm secure. It unfortunately doesn't really work that way. Digital security is more about a way of thinking, it's about a way of living, it's a general. It's much more general than that, and it's not only about the one-off use of specific tools. There is no silver bullet, and there's no such thing as perfect security either. But we don't optimize for perfect security, which is unrealistic. What we optimize for is for as most security as possible, which is definitely better than less security, right? And the interesting thing as well is that what we've seen from the documents is that a lot of the companies or the platforms, communications platforms are targeted, are some of the biggest ones, like Google, Facebook, and so on. And the reason why they're targeted is because, well, simply, they host the most users. So while it might be harder, for example, to break into Google because they have arguably some of the best security engineers in the world, they will still target Google because it's a honeypot for the masses' data. So again, we might want to consider using alternative platforms, which aren't obviously such big honeypots for intelligence agencies. If you're interested in alternative platforms, then you can go to myshadow.org/resources. That is part of another project that we work on at Tactical Tech. And here, this is basically like an app center. But unlike most app centers that you'll see, this one includes various alternative tools that you can use, for example, if you want to secure your browser, if you want to secure your chats, your calls, and so on. But yeah, did I want to say anything? No, I think that's it, more or less. So again, for Surveillance Without Borders, do we have time? Or, I don't know. Yeah? Okay. So this is, oops. Claudia. Okay, so never mind, it's okay. So if you go to surveillanceWithoutBorders.com, as I mentioned, that is the, okay, that's weird. If you go to surveillanceWithoutBorders.com, you will see the, okay, thank you. Sorry? I see. That's okay, you can leave that. Ah, there. So, here we go. So this is Surveillance Without Borders, and as you can see here, like there are 6 categories. So the first category is political leaders under surveillance. So what you can see is that all of the revelations have been classified under this category per country, as you can see the map below. If you click here, you can see corporations under surveillance, and the colored countries are the ones which are specific to that. And if you scroll down, you can find all the documents, all the information. And then, for example, if you click on this, you can find some data about some of the questions that I mentioned earlier. And yeah, so on for the other categories as well. There's also global. The interesting thing about the global is that there were a lot of documents which weren't specific to one country, but actually pertain to everyone. So, for example, PRISM and so on. And yeah, if you're interested in understanding the documents and basically raising more awareness in regards to, well, understanding the information that's in them and using that to create awareness through visualizations, through campaigns, through whatever, please do get in touch and let's discuss ideas. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Hi, thanks for the talk. So I work in a newsroom, but I'm a web developer and have been building like web software for a while. And when people talk about security and privacy and what everyone can do, we usually look at the consumer perspective, right? So we look at what can I do to secure myself when I browse the web. But are there suggestions that you have for people who make the software that we use? I mean, other than encrypting the traffic and things like that?
So, sorry, what type of suggestions are you referring to? Like,
I mean, are there resources or are there general ideas for people who make software that, like, I don't know, stores personal data so that I don't infringe on the privacy of the users, for example, things like that?
Yeah. So are you referring to the resources that I included before or generally?
Generally.
Generally. Well, yeah, I mean, for example, for media companies or other organizations.
For example, right? I mean,
like
everybody
how can they protect users'
everybody
data?
who builds software for the web stores data from
Yeah.
users, and you also mentioned that apparently Facebook or other social networks are being targeted. So why? I mean, I guess other organizations are targeted as well, right?
Yeah. No, yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah. And also a lot of media organizations like Al Jazeera has been targeted, their internal networks and many others. And you're very right to say that that raises a lot of questions because that can potentially harm have an effect on the data of the sources that they're hosting and so on. I mean, apart from encryption in the sense of like, I don't know, encrypting their servers, making sure that the data that they host is encrypted, using HTTPS to ensure that if they're moving data, that it's encrypted in transit. Perhaps compartmentalizing data sets, not having everything all together in one place, different servers for different things. Yeah, and I'm not sure I understand what other kind of practices you're referring. Do you have something in mind in specific, perhaps?
Yeah, I thought more about, are there resources for people who like make decisions when building software? Like, you know, you have security in a box, for example, but that's targeted at people who like use software, right?
Yeah.
Not targeted at people who make software. Is there something like that?
No, but we are creating I mean...
It's more a technical resource for developers, so of course if you're user,
Yeah.
but for example, the conference was suggesting at the end by the the conference he was suggesting at the end of the previous talk was intended to developer.
Okay.
But are different targets, so normally in this kind of talk, you don't assume that the audience want to make a secure app. It's good. An interesting aspect is also having a transparency policy on which cloud provider are you using. Because the app masks where your data reside, and maybe you have a concern on making your personal data in a certain country where you are not considered an user with some right.
But apart from that, with Cisco Tech, actually, we're currently working on creating something as under Secure in a Box, which is an organizational security guide, which is basically like the types of strategies and the tools that organizations can use, to implement security on an organization level, on a bigger level, which is beyond policies. It's a combination of both policies, strategies, and tools. It's not very specific to what you asked, but this is I don't know, apart from what Claudio mentioned, this is the closest I can imagine in regards to doing that at an organization level. Any other questions? Ideas, thoughts, comments? Nothing? Great.
I can ask afterwards. I was just going to ask a little bit about the methodology for gathering all of this information and how you plan on going forward with the project.
That's a great question, and I'm kind of glad you asked. That was a bit of a painful process, to be honest, because, yeah, I mean, in theory, some of the data, the process of collecting it can be automated in theory. So, for example, that's how other projects like Transparency Toolkit, when they created their Snowden doc search and so on, they basically automate the collection of specific keywords like, I don't know, like NSA, country codes, and so on. And based on that, they were able to classify them. But the classification of documents, in most cases, you can't automate the collection of this data. So it's actually a manual process. So it actually involves manually going through the documents. So if you go to GitHub, the link that I showed, and you see the CSVs, you will see that there are columns and that there are specific categories. So for example, for the question of what type of surveillance, you can't automate that. So in many cases, you won't even find the answer clearly written in text. In many cases, you kind of have to read the whole thing, understand it in context, and infer what the type of surveillance is. Or in some cases, for example, where the question is why, again, it's good not to infer, but I prefer to use things that are actually explicit in the documents, but in some cases you're able to infer and you're able to understand contextually what the answer is. So this actually involves a lot of work actually. It's very manual. It's manual labor actually, and it's having some prior knowledge about these topics and kind of and that is why it took so long to complete actually, because technically I started this in early 2014, but I only gained a website now because on the one hand I've been doing that in my free time, on the other hand it was something that again requires a lot of manual work to collect all this data. Again, the methodology was basically I phrased specific questions that I wanted to answer, the questions which were in the beginning of the presentation, like who, what, why, and so on. And then I try to find answers to that specifically in the documents. Now, going forward, I realize that this will be hard to continue going forward because, this actually requires a lot of time to manually do this. And it is quite painful, I must admit. But that is exactly why I put it on GitHub, because, I don't know, I'm hoping that more people will be able to contribute to this data collection, or even just other methodologies. And one of the things that I have in mind is that maybe going forward, maybe a sort of wizard will be implemented where users, where it can be more clear-cut to users, how they can submit data rather than having to do it through GitHub and so on. So I still need to figure out a way of making the methodology data collection easier for other users. And that's kind of in the plans of going forward. Other plans of going forward is basically, this, to my understanding, the documents, there are still, millions of documents which haven't been disclosed, and so probably until we die, the documents will still be leaked, and so this will be a never-ending process, never-ending project. But the idea here was not so much about the data collection itself. It was more to illustrate that, hey, there is some interesting information in the documents. Let's find it, and let's find interesting and maybe meaningful ways of showing that to the world, of creating narratives and of taking action. The hope is that this will lead to more action, because the thing is that, I don't know, on the one hand, I really like the idea of transparency, but when we just leak documents, and when they're not categorized, they're not contextualized, and so on. I mean, it is good for the Snowden documents because they were contextualized with media articles. But to be frank, in many cases, these media articles seem to be a little bit biased about what they were covering. Because, for example, when you see the documents that they're referring to, they refer to, I don't know, 20 countries, and in the media article, they only talk about one country. And then it's like, okay, why did they choose to talk about only the specific country when actually there are so many other countries involved? And this kind of makes you wonder about what interests might be behind the writing of these articles. So I think that we shouldn't only rely on what specific journalists choose to tell us about the documents. We should try to find that information for ourselves. And this is just one example of doing it and hopefully creating the ground for others to do it as well. But more specifically going forward, I've started collaborating with the Courage Foundation. So they are hosting one of the main archives of the Snowden documents. There are two main archives. There's the one from the Courage Foundation, but also one from the Canadian, so basically a department from the University of Toronto is hosting another archive. No, not Citizen Lab. It's a different one. Anyway, so I'm collaborating with them because basically Surveillance Without Borders is building on top of the archive. So they did the initial archiving, and then based on the archiving that they did, then I basically used the revelations as archived by them to then subsequently categorize them, collect data, and so on. And so going forward, we're going to be doing some talks over the next few months where we're going to do some events for students and for other groups and for journalists where we explain to them how they can use this data as part of their work and how they can contribute to this, what type of action can be taken. The hope is that this will inspire lawyers potentially around the world to take more action, because there are many examples in the documents and as illustrated by Surveillance Without Borders that a lot of this is clearly unlawful, and yet you haven't always seen the legal action you would imagine to see, and then the question is why? Or for example, when you see cases of like, I don't know, the climate summit been spied on, this has an effect on what measures are taken globally in terms of climate change. Where are the environmental activists? Where's the, you know what I mean? So I feel like a lot of reason why the actions you would hope or imagine to be taken as a result of the documents hasn't been done, because a lot of information has gotten lost through the huge leak of documents and also through the sometimes biased coverage of specific documents by specific journalists. So I don't know, I mean, to be frank, I also have a full-time job, so I don't think I'm not going to put in that much time into this. But I am always excited to figure out new ways of going forward and to keep it alive over the next years and see how we can collaborate with different groups. Oh, sorry, and a last disclaimer. Surveillance Without Borders, I realize, is a very, very horrible name. But frankly, I couldn't think of something better because I suck at finding names. But the idea was basically that it just illustrates that it is Surveillance Without Borders, but hopefully by working across different sectors and trying to understand this and trying to take action for transparency and to limit these type of actions, hopefully we'll be able to limit Surveillance Without Borders, or at least limit the global surveillance ecosystem. Anyway, I've ranted enough. Thanks.